If the king were to invite them, it's understood they would automatically get some sort of security. So there's a way around it, Christo. No?
Well, I mean, look, this sounds a little bit like blackmail, in as much as if you want to see me, then you have to ask me. There is nothing stopping Harry, if he wants to coming here. The idea that he would go to Sandringham and not have any security whatsoever is absolute nonsense. What are they going to do? Not look after him, not make sure that he's protected if he's in Sandringham seeing the king. So the idea he has to be asked by the king is absolutely ridiculous.
Well, he can't just show up, can he, really?
No, but he can say, I would like to bring my children to see you. I'm coming on this date because I know you're at Sandringham. I mean, that's what would be absolutely reasonable. And of course, he would be protected if he did that. The idea he wouldn't be is complete and utter nonsense. I mean, if he wants to come, he can. I would probably, if I was the king, say to him, you're more than welcome to come. Would love to see you. Here's a non-disclosure agreement. You can't put anything that we've spoken about on a Netflix show. You can't write a book about it. You can't do anything else. And I don't want to see it on chapter 17 of your next diatribe.
There is that betrayal, I suppose, for the king.
Why is it a betrayal?
Because you can't have private conversations and put them in a book if you're in a family.
Actually, Charles did in his book.
Well,
People forget.
That was in response to the Andrew Morton book.
No, he revealed his relationship with his father. How
we're going back 30 years.
So, you can't have double standards here.
There is a difference.
But also, I can't understand your viewpoint.
Why?
He's his father. His father's getting old. His father clearly wants to see him and the grandchildren. What does it matter to you if the king issues a formal invitation and everything is covered, including security? Why would you mind?
Well, look, if he wants to, like I said, he absolutely can. I would be very cautious about doing that. And the difference, I think, from what you're talking about with the book that Charles worked on with Jonathan Dimbleby, is that what you're referring to is when he spoke about the harshness of his upbringing, which I think was in a couple of pages of the book, whereas the whole of Harry's book was called Spare, and it was the entire modus operandi of the book, the entire thread of the book was, my life has been terrible, here's an entire book devoted to it. It's not a couple of pages.
Let's just forgive it.
It's not true.
Can't we just forgive?
Actually,
but in the end, sorry, just to try. But let's put that to one side, Christo, because actually, blood is thicker than water. And Charles is, as Yasmin says, Charles is his dad. And if they mess around anymore, Charles won't be here to have this reconciliation.
But would it not be damaging to then have them come over? I don't trust that they wouldn't use it to either complain more, monetize, come up with more content for themselves, or anything else. And that actually damages the monarchy on a wider level.
You're talking about monetising? William and the king, between them, are ripping off this nation on their duchies, OK? And you don't mind about that. There are properties that they're letting out which are scandalous. And you don't mind that. And you mind these people.
Yeah, I do mind these people.
Why?
Because they have left the family and they use the family in order to monetise themselves.
No.
If they want to leave the family...
They're making their own futures, they're earning their own money.
By sagging off the family constantly.
Let's be very clear about what we've just heard, because beneath the polite tones and the back and forth, there's something much bigger going on here than a simple disagreement about family visits. This isn't just about whether Prince Harry can pop over to Sandringham. This is about power, control, security, and the rewriting of reality in real time. You heard the argument laid out plainly. If the king invites him, he'll automatically get security, so there's a way around it. Sounds simple, doesn't it? Almost too simple. Because what that framing does very cleverly is shift responsibility away from the system and place it squarely on Harry himself. It turns a structural issue into a personal one. It suggests that if Harry isn't seeing his father, it's because he's choosing not to. But that's not the full picture. Not even close. Let's unpack the logic being presented. The claim is that Harry can come to the UK anytime he wants, that he'll be protected if he stays on royal grounds, and that the idea of him lacking security is complete and utter nonsense. But here's the problem. Security for someone like Prince Harry isn't just about standing inside the gates of Sandringham. It's about the entire journey. It's about arrival, departure, movement, visibility, risk exposure. You don't switch danger on and off like a light. And this is where the conversation starts to fall apart under scrutiny. Because if everything is so simple, if Harry is fully protected the moment he steps onto royal property, then why has this been a years-long legal and political battle? Why has it gone through courts? Why has it required formal decisions at the highest levels? These are not the hallmarks of a problem that can be solved with a casual invitation. But then comes the most revealing part of the exchange. The suggestion almost said jokingly, but not really, that if Harry were to visit, he should be handed a non-disclosure agreement, an NDA. Think about that for a second. If I were king, I'd say you're welcome. Here is your NDA. That statement tells you everything about the mindset at play, because it frames Harry not as a son, not as a member of the family, but as a liability, as a potential threat, as someone who must be managed, contained, controlled. And the irony? It's almost impossible to ignore. This is the same institution, this same firm that has spent decades operating in a way that many critics describe as selective when it comes to privacy. The same system where stories appear in tabloids with uncanny timing. The same system where anonymous sources, palace insiders, and carefully placed narratives shape public perception on a daily basis. And yet now, suddenly, the concern is confidentiality. Now, the concern is trust. Let's not pretend this is new. The idea that information flows out of royal circles strategically, deliberately, is not some fringe theory. It's widely acknowledged. There have been years, decades, of reporting that point to internal briefings, competing camps, and media relationships that serve very specific agendas. Whether it's associated with the household of King Charles III or the orbit of Prince William, the pattern is familiar. Stories don't just appear out of thin air. They're fed. So when people clutch their pearls and say, "How could Harry reveal private conversations?" you have to ask, where was that outrage when details about him, his wife, and even his children were appearing in the press? Where was the concern about privacy then? Because it didn't start with Harry, and it certainly didn't end with him. Now, let's address another claim from that exchange, that Harry coming to the UK without a formal invitation is somehow unreasonable, that he can't just show up. But then, in the same breath, it suggested he could simply inform his father, "I'm coming on this date." So, which is it? Is he free to come, or isn't he? Because those two positions don't quite align. What we're really seeing here is a contradiction. On one hand, the narrative says nothing is stopping him. On the other, it quietly acknowledges that access, protection, and even the basic logistics of a visit are conditional. And those conditions matter, especially when safety is involved. And let's talk about that safety, because this is where the conversation often becomes dismissive in a way that's frankly quite striking. The idea that concerns about security are exaggerated, that they're overblown, that they're somehow a negotiating tactic. But think about the reality. Prince Harry is not just any public figure. He is someone with a very specific history, a military background, a global profile, and crucially, a documented history of threats. Every time he travels to the UK, there is a level of risk involved. That's not speculation, that's a matter of record. And it's precisely why security decisions around him are taken so seriously. So when people reduce that to, oh, he'll be fine once he's at Sandringham, it misses the point entirely. Because the danger isn't confined to one location. It exists in movement, in exposure, in unpredictability. And here's something that often gets overlooked. Harry has indicated a willingness to pay for his own security. Let that sink in. He's not asking for something for free. He's not demanding taxpayer-funded protection without question. He has, at various points, made it clear that he is prepared to cover the cost himself, and yet he's been told he cannot. So the argument that this is about entitlement doesn't quite hold up, because if someone is offering to pay for their own safety and is still denied, that's no longer about money. That's about control. Now, let's move to the emotional core of the discussion, the idea that this is ultimately about a father and a son. That time is passing, that reconciliation is urgent, that blood is thicker than water. And on the surface, that's a compelling argument. Of course it is. Family matters. Time matters. But relationships don't exist in a vacuum. They exist within context, within history, within patterns of behavior. And when trust has been eroded on both sides, simply saying, "Come over and let's move on," isn't always realistic, especially when the underlying issues haven't been resolved. And this is where the conversation about betrayal comes in. The suggestion that Harry crossed a line by speaking publicly, by writing a book, by sharing his experiences. But then, almost immediately, that narrative is challenged, because history tells a more complicated story. Members of the royal family have spoken publicly before. They have authorized biographies. They have given interviews. They have shared personal details, sometimes very personal details. So the idea that Harry uniquely violated some sacred code of silence doesn't quite stand up to scrutiny. What's really being debated here isn't whether information should ever be shared. It's who gets to share it, and under what conditions. Because when information is released in a controlled, strategic way, it's called communication. But when it comes from someone outside that control, suddenly it becomes betrayal. That's the double standard at the heart of this entire debate. And it's one that people are starting to notice more and more. Now, let's address another point raised in that exchange, the idea that Harry and Meghan have monetized their connection to the royal family, that they've built careers by criticizing the institution. It's a familiar argument, one we've heard countless times, but it deserves closer examination. Because the reality is, they stepped away from official royal duties. They chose to become financially independent. And in doing so, they entered a world where storytelling, media, and public engagement are part of how you sustain that independence. That's not unusual. That's the modern reality for public figures. And yet, when they do it, it's framed as exploitation. While other forms of royal income, far less scrutinized, are treated as perfectly acceptable, there's a disconnect there, a significant one. And it was actually pointed out quite bluntly in that exchange. The mention of duchies, of property portfolios, of financial arrangements that benefit senior royals. These are not small matters. They're substantial. They involve real money, real assets, real influence. But somehow those conversations don't generate the same level of outrage. They don't dominate headlines in the same way. Instead, the focus returns again and again to Harry and Meghan. What they said, what they did, what they might do next. And that brings us back to the central tension. Trust. Or, more accurately, the lack of it. Because when someone says, "I wouldn't trust them not to turn this into content," What they're really expressing is fear. Fear of losing control over the narrative. Fear of being exposed. Fear of not being able to manage the story. But trust is a two-way street. It doesn't exist in isolation. And if one side feels that their private conversations have already been shared through leaks, briefings, or otherwise, then the expectation of silence becomes complicated. In fact, you could argue that if anyone has reason to be cautious, it's Harry. Because the track record suggests that information doesn't always stay within the family, that it finds its way out, quietly, anonymously, strategically. So when the idea of an NDA is floated, there's a certain irony to it, because you could just as easily flip that argument. You could just as easily say that it's Harry who would be justified in asking for assurances, in asking for boundaries, in asking for protection, not just physical but reputational. And that flips the narrative entirely. It challenges the assumption that he is the sole source of disclosure. It raises the possibility that the flow of information has never been one-directional. Now, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. What we're witnessing here is not just a family disagreement. It's a public debate about how institutions operate, about transparency versus control, about who gets to define the truth. Because the monarchy by its very nature relies on perception, on image, on carefully managed narratives. And when those narratives are challenged, the response is often to reassert control, to reframe the conversation, to shift the focus. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. A reframing of a security issue into a question of willingness. A reframing of a trust issue into a question of betrayal. A reframing of a complex family dynamic into a simple choice, come or don't come. But reality is rarely that simple. And in this case, it's anything but. Because at the heart of it all is a fundamental question. Can there be genuine reconciliation without addressing the underlying issues? Without acknowledging the role of the system? Without confronting the patterns that led to this situation in the first place? Or is the expectation simply that one side returns, accepts the conditions, and moves on? Because if it's the latter, then what's being offered isn't reconciliation. It's compliance. And that's a very different thing. So when you hear statements like, "There's nothing stopping him," it's worth pausing. It's worth asking. Nothing? Really? Not security concerns? Not legal battles? Not trust issues? Not years of public conflict? Because when you take all of that into account, the situation looks very different. It looks far more complex, far more nuanced, far less black and white. And perhaps that's the real takeaway from this entire exchange. Not that one side is entirely right and the other entirely wrong, but that the narrative being presented is incomplete, selective, simplified in a way that obscures more than it reveals. And in that gap between what's said and what's left unsaid is where the real story lies. Because this isn't just about whether a son visits his father, it's about the conditions under which that visit would happen, the guarantees that would or wouldn't be in place, and the level of trust that currently exists between them. And right now, based on everything we've seen, heard and analysed, that trust appears to be in short supply. So the next time someone says, "He can just come if he wants to," remember what's actually at stake. Because it's not just a plane ticket and a family dinner, it's security, it's control, it's narrative, it's history. And until those issues are addressed honestly, openly, and without deflection, the idea of a simple reunion will remain exactly that. An idea, not a reality.